Good day to everyone. My name is Louise Taylor. I'm the Asia Pacific representative for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, or GI-TOC for short. It's a little bit easier to go through. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our interactive workshop, Disruptive Endeavours, where our panel, as you will see, and I'll introduce them shortly, will discuss the ethics of monitoring and then also disrupting the online illegal wildlife trade. The work has been developed from GI-TOC's bespoke unit, the MMFU, or in longhand, the Market Monitoring and Friction Unit, which has been specifically created with the support of the Norwegian government to tackle and intervene into the online illegal wildlife trade. It's been specifically created also, however, with collaboration and cooperation with a wide range of stakeholders as its fundamental principle, as a baseline for our work. And as such, we are developing a series of what we call community tools that are offered up publicly and widely to anyone interested to combat this crime, whether they be civil society actors, journalists, academics, law enforcement officials, government officials, and anyone else you can think of who is interested to support tackling this crime. In the course of our work, of course, we've encountered a number of different challenges, one of which being, how do we hold ourselves accountable to the ethical concerns and dilemmas of intervening in and understanding and accessing all of this market and potentially personal data that we come across as well. And this community tool has been developed very much with those challenges in mind. So Alistair Macbeth, an analyst working with the MMFU, will talk us through in more detail how this work has come about, how this community tool has been developed, and how we can use it to best effect. We will then hear responses from Gretchen Peters from the Alliance to Counter Crime Online and Elisa Davies from the World Parrot Trust, who will share their views on the community tool, their experiences of working in this field and how they think this might help. We will then welcome your participation, your challenge, your questions, your comments at the end of the sort of speaking panel session, and I'll sort of talk you through at that point how we sort of facilitate that discussion. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass over to Alistair. Alistair, if you'd like to talk us through the work so far, please, it'd be lovely to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. So give me a second, just get my screen shared. So as Louise was saying, we developed this tool, Disruptive Endeavours, to help organisations research the online illegal wildlife trade. It's been produced in partnership with ACO. I don't need to go much more into the Market Monitoring Friction Unit. I think Louise just gave a fantastic presentation of what the unit's about. What I would say is that we do have a website on our about the MMFU, and we do have an email address as well, but I'll talk about that a bit at the end. The main, so unlike law enforcement, journalism and academics, civil society actors don't have an accepted professional ethical standards to guide their research. So we have developed this community tool to respond to the ethical dilemma of how should civil society actors balance the ethical imperatives to respond to wildlife crime while taking seriously equally important responsibilities around user privacy, mass data collection, and adhering to a platform's terms of service. To answer this question, we split it into three distinct sections that make up the sections of the community tool. These are the ethics of intervention or private policing, the ethics of data collection and privacy, and the ways of mitigating the risks and unintended consequences. One of the aims of the MMFU is to share its knowledge to increase the number of successful interventions through not just ourselves, but also the wider community of civil society organisations. It was developed alongside our work researching online illegal wildlife trade, but also through meetings and discussions with a wide array of experts and academics in ethical research, criminology, and IT. At the start of the guidance, we have quite a detailed description of explaining the reasons behind us producing this guidance. But in summary, it was because we realized there was a gap in the knowledge base that very few people were addressing. So we wanted to fill that gap in a way that would give greater knowledge to the community in general and to, as I say, increase the effectiveness of interventions. We've also believed that the teachings that we've discovered from developing this tool are transferable to other crime types, especially if they are involved with research on the online web and the collection of data. So the main reason behind this presentation is to give you a feeling of how this guidance can be used to help research projects and how it can be used to inform decision making. On the left, you can see the 3 different sections, along with a selection of the ethical concerns within each section. The guidance aims to give provides an overview of the ethical dilemma and provides approaches for assessing and navigating them. Instead of going through them all one by one, what we're going to talk about is 3 tools that we've developed that are in the guidance to give you a much more interactive feel about how it can be used in sort of practice for projects. So we're going to talk about a risk matrix we developed to help ascertain the risks associated with intervention activities, a decision tree that we've developed to help navigate the ethics of data collection and privacy. We developed decision trees, as I say, for each section to make them more user-friendly. And we've also developed an interactive decision trees that are available on our website. We're going to discuss the one that shows the ways of mitigating risks and the unintended consequences associated with research of this nature. So what you see here, this is an example of a risk matrix that we've developed. It's a tool that we suggest organizations develop to aid their work conducting disruption activities. This one, we don't suggest you copy this one exactly, but instead use it as a guide to how you can develop one relevant to your projects. Although it's not possible to predict every ethical considerations that are part of the research project, it's a good exercise to try and identify problems in advance to commencing projects, so you know how to react when they do occur. But also, as projects progress, you have to have an open eye for how to adapt as you move throughout the project and problems become, you become aware to problems you may not have realized before. So an example of how you would use a matrix like this, if we were to take an example of a prolific wildlife seller selling endangered birds on a specific platform, and you believe that they are a serious figure that is not going to be dealt with by law enforcement or the enforcement actions of an internet platform, or indeed anyone else, you can look at ways of possibly disrupting their operation by introducing friction. One way we have identified is by using sending them lots of questions in a manner that they would have to spend time answering, or indeed leave them disparaging comments which they're going to have to respond to. Such a response will obviously slow down their abilities to respond to genuine comments and may introduce an element of doubt as to what inquiries are relevant, are genuine, and which ones are not. What's important about the risk matrix, though, is it identifies the possible whether risks that are associated with such an intervention. 2 examples of risks that are associated with the behaviour we just talked about is that we could inadvertently stimulate demand, or we could target a legal seller. The stimulating of demand is quite a significant problem. Of course, if we are sending lots of requests to an individual inquiring about an endangered bird, it is possible, indeed maybe even likely, that they will then talk to their supply chain, and it may result at the end of more species being captured in the wild to meet the demand that we have inadvertently generated. In regards to the legal seller, that's obviously a very serious point as well. One area that you need to be aware of is that you have to know the problem you would realize with illicit markets, especially environmental crime, is that there's a lot of grey within the legal definitions. In some countries, some actions are illegal, some are not illegal in other countries. So you need to do a lot of research and understanding about where you're standing and what the legality is within a certain illicit flow. So you know that you're not targeting individuals who may be actually acting within the law of their country. The last 2 columns at the right, one talks about harm level. That's what's been inflicted on the trader, and the risk level, that's the risk to the researcher conducting the research. The higher the harm level we've given, those interventions that we've given the higher the harm level to are those that are more directly impacting a trader, i.e. deleting their accounts and leaving negative reviews on their sites, while those with the lower harm levels are more indirect, which are primarily public awareness campaigns aimed at disparaging buyers from them. Risk is a similar approach with high, medium, and low. High means that we're those intervention tactics and where we're in direct contact with the seller, the trader, while those that are classed as low, we've got a distance between ourselves and the trader. So there's less risk of the researcher being harmed or experiencing any unintended consequences from their work. What I would point out quickly is that only proportionate harm should be used to what's being what you're trying to add friction to. So we suggest that starting from low, then working way up to high. So there's not much point cracking a nut with a hammer. So you might cause unintended consequences for very little gain. Here is an example of the risk matrix that we developed for the second part of the guidance. The areas of data collection and privacy are quite a serious one, especially now since data privacy legislation is quite a significant part, especially within developed countries. And so it's very important we adhere to that legislation. However, in countries where there is lacking data protection legislation, we want to give broad principles of how you should ethically behave in these countries, especially if you're from a country where you have higher levels of data protection. It addresses a problem that isn't really addressed with academic ethics, i.e. the problems that tend to come up of informed consent and voluntary participation being required as not a requirement of academic ethics. There are ones that we can't really, by and large, adhere to due to the nature of organised crime. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to get voluntary participation from people who we are investigating. So we take the approach that we have to strike a balance between the considerations for individuals and the benefit to wider society. And that's what this section of the guidance document tries to address. So the decision tree summarizes the main points for the guidance to make it more user-friendly and more accessible. So the main questions are seen in grey, which are followed by predominantly yes or no questions, which are then followed by the ethical concerns and possible solutions. So if we were to look at looking to conduct covert research, the box at the top near the center asks if we're conducting active or passive surveillance to monitor social media or e-commerce sites. So we'll be taking active monitoring. We'll then ask if we're doing covert and overt. We're doing covert, and then it'll ask us if we require certain details of undertaking to gain access to a closed group, i.e. fake photographs or phone numbers. If we were required to do that, we should check whether that's a criminal acceptable, if we will be conducting a criminal offence by doing so. If that would constitute a criminal offence, we advise you obviously do not proceed. But if it doesn't, we outline some mitigation strategies to take. So determine in advance the level of risk that we're willing to endure. Appropriate precautions should be taken to protect the identity of the researcher, including aliases and VPNs, and be aware of any mental health concerns of a researcher, depending on what's being researched within the group. So those decision trees that we've also developed in electronic form that are available on our website, basically just to offer an alternative means of accessing them and to make them more user-friendly, depending on preference, basically. So let's see if we can do this transfer. So when you access one, you'll be greeted by a landing page that just tells you the details of who we are and what we're doing. And there'll be a series of questions from which to work through, and it'll give you a response answer at the end. So if we're asked, is there a risk of innocent people being included in the data collection? If we were to answer yes, we'll then be advised to target our data collection on prior known criminal patterns to avoid including people who may not be involved in the illicit trade. And also to know that checks should be made to researchers are aware of what constitutes legal and illegal trades, again, to avoid the introduction, the inclusion of innocent people. And also at this point, we're talking about at the end, but the accidental or deliberate transgressions of staff into unethical or illegal behaviour is something to be aware about when conducting research of this nature, especially when using behind a computer. They would ask you, again, if they're going to be exposed to extreme content over prolonged periods. If you answer no, we'd then check if you came into any contact with extreme content. And then if the researcher has any emotional connection to the subject. And again, it will tell you what risk mitigation strategies should be taken. And that will go through the whole series of questions until you reach the end. So just to finish up, I just want to talk about the risks of individuals or organizations who are using these disruption tactics, but using them from behind a computer. There is a risk of accidental or deliberate transgressions into unethical behaviors. So it's very important there are structures and thresholds and checklists in position prior to commencing research of this nature, so that any transgressions, either accidental or deliberate, can be identified early on. It is also important to have a pre-agreed set of ethical codes, an ethical code in advance, so which you can work to guide the research. This code we believe it can be amended, but any amendments have to be justified prior to any transgressions and receive authority in a written form, so it can be reviewed later. That's not only just because, that's primarily so we can be a learning tool, so we can adapt as moving forward, as this is quite a fast moving environment. What we think is the most important thing though is the culture of openness, both within teams, within organizations in general, but also within the wider community doing research of this nature, so we can learn from each other's successes, as well as, no doubt, there might be a few mistakes, and so we become better prepared as we move towards, hopefully, introducing more disruption into these illicit markets. So what I would say finally, just on that note, big part of this tool is to stimulate conversation around this research. So we're really keen to hear other people's experiences, those who have done research of this nature, as well as people's viewpoints from experience with illegal wildlife markets. So our email address, mmfu@globalinitiative.net. If you have questions, ideas, or just want to share the experience, we're very happy and very grateful if you would be able to share these to help us and the wider community move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alistair. Really good way of talking us through some complex issues and presenting them in a way that actually sort of facilitates that movement through some of those really difficult and thorny questions. So I'd like to hand over to Gretchen now. And so Gretchen, as I mentioned, is from the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. We've been working quite closely in the development of this tool, understanding some of the challenges, and Gretchen is an expert in researching and mapping transnational organized crime networks across multiple markets. So wildlife crime and human trafficking, illegal timber trafficking, corruption, and narcotics. Gretchen, would you be able to give us your experience of navigating these murky waters and how that you feel this tool might be able to help the community with which you're regularly engaged?
Sure, and to start, thank you for that introduction, Louise. And I want to start by thanking GI-TOC as well as the Norwegian government for funding this work. The Alliance to Counter Crime was thrilled to collaborate on the development of this tool and on some other research projects that were and monitoring projects that we're doing together. Our mission is to improve the systems that are currently, or reform the systems that are currently facilitating a lot of crime, a lot of serious crime on the internet. And so we think that this tool is an important one that can be used in the wildlife space, but also more broadly applied to other serious crimes that are happening, in particular on social media platforms. And that can range, as Louise mentioned, from human trafficking to drug sales to and the horrible spread of child sex abuse content. I want to start by saying that I'm going to somewhat contradict myself here, because on the one hand, I firmly believe that conservationists and civil society actors engaged or that are wanting to protect animals and help animals have a really important role to play in tracking online crime. There has been an absolute explosion in scale of wildlife crime online in the last 5 to 7 years. And that's partly driven by the ubiquity of smartphones, by the rise of social media, and by the algorithmic amplification that social media platforms implement that grows the size of these wildlife markets and connects buyers and sellers in a way that they have never been connected before. This has resulted in, or there's a situation because of outdated laws governing cyberspace, and also the borderless nature of cyberspace that creates jurisdictional challenges for law enforcement agencies to patrol this information or to patrol these crimes as well. Wildlife crime is typically under-resourced compared to other serious crime. And therefore you have this huge void in action against a problem that is growing rapidly and causing many endangered species, or has at least a correlative impact on many endangered species that are going into population collapse. And Elisa can talk about that later in our discussion about parrots. So there's an incredibly important role for conservationists, biologists, experts, in particular endangered wildlife species to play. But what we see is that many people get involved in this and they don't have the background, the grounding in the law, in the ethical issues surrounding data collection and privacy, and they might put themselves and their own team members at risk of physical harm or legal liability, and they might also cause more harm than they actually, rather than protecting animals. Reducing harm has got to be the guiding principle of any organization that starts engaging in this type of work. And for us, that's very important. And so we have worked to help our members, and in the projects we've done ourselves, we've spent a lot of time trying to develop projects that consider all of the different minefields that you could stumble into as you go online to research crime. One thing that a point that I would like to make to ordinary people who might be watching this or who might watch this webinar later is that to some extent, you can help save animals online simply by not engaging in illegal wildlife content that is online. One of the problems we have seen both in the wildlife space but also in other crime spaces is that well-intentioned people go online, they want to be investigators, they find something and then they click on it, they comment on it, they start sharing it with their friends. One of our members, Patricia Tricarace, has written a great Medium piece, a great article, which I've sent to the hosts, and hopefully they'll post it on the board here, that says you can help save animals without lifting a finger. Every time you click on wildlife crime content online, you help drive those algorithms that are spreading it to more people. So to some extent, you can do more by not engaging the content, or at least if you're going to report content to the platform, at least just screenshot it and send in a screenshot instead of clicking on it and sharing it with your friends. The worst example of this is in the child sex abuse content space. There have been problems where vigilante groups get all worked up when they find a piece of content and they end up spreading the harm by causing those images of that innocent child to be spread widely across the internet. There's also the issue of, so I say that, be cautious about how you engage because they're very easy, they're real risks for spreading harm. At the same time, conservationists, animal experts, people with expertise in particular species can bring real expertise and can understand when an image, when an animal that is portrayed from a certain region must be wild captured as opposed to raised and therefore legal to trade. There's all sorts of ways that that experts really bring an important knowledge to the fight. And so what we what I love about the decision trees and the tools that have been developed here is that they help you design a program and make decisions around, do you report information? Do you try to get a seller deplatformed? By deplatforming that seller, does that destroy the evidence that the crime existed or that the crime took place? Some of our researchers will sit on something for months, if not years, and they will not report a trafficker to the platforms, not because they don't want it to stop, but because they're trying to get law enforcement cooperation to actually go after the trafficker. So sometimes when you report information to some of the bigger platforms, if they do act on it at all, they will delete the content. So even by reporting it, you can actually do more harm because the data goes away. Another issue that is important that we consider in each of our projects is the legal compliance. Alistair talked on the issue of legal compliance under GDPR and other privacy regulations. Those differ from country to country. There's a question of how you store data. This is particularly true if you're doing big data analytics. So we have various members that will scrape huge amounts of data to be able to look for the traffickers, inside the wildlife traffickers or other criminals operating inside that big group of data. But you have, by doing that, you have not only probably violated the rules of that platform, but you've also sucked down a bunch of private data about thousands, maybe millions of innocent people. And so you need to have a plan for how to anonymize that data, how to dispose of that data, and how to store it if you do need to keep it. In addition, Alistair touched on the issue of informed consent. If in the academic space, having myself developed research projects with universities, you typically have to go through an institutional review board where and there's good reasons for these boards to make sure that your project is ethical, that your subjects that you're researching have been informed. There are workarounds, there are exceptions if you're studying crime. You obviously cannot tell a group of criminals or people engaging in crime as buyers or sellers that you're researching them, or they will change their behavior. So there are exceptions to those rules, but you do need to think about how you are engaging them. Alistair also touched on the issue of passive versus active collection. Some of our members at ACCO simply track what's going on online, and they screenshot it, or they record the size of the markets, the changing trends they're seeing in the markets. Other members actually set up fake accounts, set up avatars, and directly engage criminals to find out what's going on. Obviously, there are a lot of pitfalls there. You cannot go online and commit a crime, or you will be liable for that crime. You can sometimes engage in criminal activity if you're doing so in partnership with a law enforcement organization, but those agreements have to be signed before you start engaging in it. We've had multiple requests, typically coming from the media, for us to go online and buy something illegally to show how easy it is to do. Obviously, I mean, I feel like it should be obvious to everybody, that's a really bad idea. Sometimes we'll find groups that think that what they need to do is show the world how easy it is to commit crime online. It is easy to commit crime online. That doesn't mean you should be doing it too in order to show the world. It's much better to record what you're seeing and make reports about it. The other question, another big issue that we try to get our members to think about is anonymizing the accounts that we report on in our public facing material. Sometimes you might report a trafficker to law enforcement, but in terms of our public facing material, we always anonymize the name and anybody who has been commenting underneath. Those could be innocent people. Those could be accounts that have been taken over by a criminal that belong to an innocent person. So you do not want to accidentally harm somebody whose picture is being used in a criminal's online avatar or an innocent person who is being victimized by that criminal. We've had many cases where or multiple cases that I can think of where we're doing active engagement with the criminal network, and we find out that the criminals are using the account that belongs to a young person that they happen to know, or maybe in their family, a cousin or a brother or a sister that they can use. So you have to be really careful about the legality of exposing the people that you're looking at online. You also have to think about the vulnerable groups that are involved: children, people who have been trafficked, people who are being forced into engaging in criminal activity online by others who control them. And lastly, I want to say, perhaps the most important thing is you have to think about protecting your staff. You have to think about protecting your team members from potential liabilities, whether it's putting out libelous information about a person that they're tracking online, or just becoming harmed emotionally, or developing PTSD or some similar ailment as a result of consuming a lot of this material, which at times can be very, very upsetting. Again, I want to thank GI-TOC for inviting us to participate in preparing this report and this community tool. We hope it gets used widely, and we hope people really stop and think about it before they don't just roll into one of these projects without going through the steps that we have spent a lot of time outlining for this project.
Thank you, Gretchen. I was taken by a few things about what you said. I mean, you know, the focus on harm, I think, is really important. And as you touched on, there are significant legal issues, not just ethical ones, in this debate. And you talked as well about the explosion of crime online and how that's come about. And of course, that's also been prevalent because of COVID. And that's definitely what our research shows as well. So it's a particularly timely moment to have this conversation. So thank you so much. Alisa, I'd like to hand over to you now, if I may. So Alisa's joined us from the World Parrot Trust, where she's a wildlife trade specialist. And Alisa has significant experience of exploring the social media for evidences, and she's been investigating social media for looking at trade of birds online. So you've had direct experience of this, Alisa. So tell us what it feels like from your perspective, please.
Yeah, thank you, Louise. And just I want to say thank you to GI-TOC, to Alistair, to everyone who was involved in creating this toolkit and creating this document, because I mean, it's something that I have been grappling with over the last years as I've been working in this. And this kind of bringing together all these issues is exactly the kind of thing that I, as someone who's been working in this area, both in academia and as part of an NGO, it addresses a lot of the various questions and various issues that I've been grappling with personally doing this work. Just a little introduction. So I work for the World Parrot Trust. I started working with them through my master's research, which was looking at the bird trade on social media. And so that's how I started out. And then now what I'm doing is that I'm still conducting I've recently conducted some research which looks at online monitoring. But I'm also involved in actively and ongoingly monitoring illegal trade in parrots on social media, particularly the illegal trade in African grey parrots, which are endangered and still very much threatened by illegal trade. But yeah, this is something I've experienced in academia and as an NGO. So what I want to do is, like I said, just talk about some of my experiences and some of the ethical actions we've taken to try and make sure our work is as ethical as possible, and some of the various issues we faced. So yeah, to begin with, I started out doing my master's project, looking in trade in birds from West Africa on social media and using it to try and understand which species were involved. This wasn't necessarily illegal trade, although some illegal trade was involved in it, in those sort of, particularly in grey and tinmay parrots, where international trade is prohibited. But it was more about gathering information about an understudied area of trade. And for that, I had to get an ethical approval from my university to carry out the study. And for that, just what we did was, it was passive and covert. And so essentially we were just looking at public content, largely on people's profiles that they were using to advertise. And some of the things we have to say was, we made an assumption that because they were using these posts to advertise trade that they knew and they intended for them to be public, and therefore we were collecting like public information that was intended and known to be public. And that's quite tricky when you're working on someone's personal profile where they're sharing personal information but also public facing information. It's quite a tricky area. We didn't interact and we didn't try and deceive them in this particular study, which meant that we could gather data without needing their informed consent, because there was this idea that it was public information. We had very limited personal data collection. We anonymized a lot of the names and only collected sort of the location as a country level so that we couldn't like identify exactly where they were. And a really important one is that we said we wouldn't provide any information that could de-anonymize these individuals. And so for our case, it meant we didn't name the platform that they were on. We didn't, any quotes, any text quotes that we included, we searched them beforehand to make sure it wouldn't lead back to the post or to the comment. And we didn't share any screenshots in those particular studies because of the risk that someone could do a reverse image search and find them. And there have been other studies that I've seen where you can just do a reverse image search on the post or reverse text search and you can find exactly who it was they were looking at. So we were very careful to avoid that. It is worth noting that these standards, those standards, we wanted to be sort of as rigorous as possible, but they're actively being negotiated and they are being changed. The standards change a lot. So for example, it's now very common for people to say the platform that they're using, while the precedent at the time that I did that ethical approval, the standard was that you didn't name the platform. And so that is something that is changing. And there are also changing and different perspectives on whether you should share screenshots. In a later study, we did in fact share some screenshots of some posts, but we blanked out all of the text information and the profile picture. And one additional step that I decided to take was that instead of doing a screenshot of a photo, which would be potentially quite easy to reverse image search, I did a screenshot from a long video and I checked that as well to make sure it wouldn't lead back to the post so that it was as safe as possible. So it was as not de-anonymizing as possible while still being able to show these conditions and demonstrate it. And so that's from an academic perspective, and that's some things that we said. But then I went on actually working for the NGO World Parrot Trust. And our objective was different in that now we're monitoring individuals involved in illegal trade and wherever possible, trying to disrupt their activities, because obviously we want to stop this from happening. And so sort of our actions and our ethical approach, well, the ethical approach stays the same, but our actions have changed slightly and the ethical implications have changed. So for example, now we're still monitoring individuals online. We're doing this manually. We don't have the skills or the experience to do sort of mass scraping, but we're following manually individuals, and we do have an avatar account which we use to try and see if they're sharing information privately, because we do know that some individuals share content in their private stories. So they'll make posts which don't show illegal activity in their private stories. They are sharing the real stock that they have, the real activity they're doing. And so this is a level of deception. And so we have to consider, is this warranted? And often it's in cases where we have reason to believe that they are involved in illegal activity before we do this, and we still don't we don't try and use this for sting operations ourselves. We are quite a small NGO and we're quite new into this area, and so we don't have the experience, the expertise to confidently carry out a kind of direct, active, deceptive engagement, whilst making sure that it's reducing harm, legally abiding by relevant laws. And so for that, we do liaise and work with law enforcement, we work with other NGOs, and we work with other professional bodies to try and take more direct action where possible. And so for this, we share, like Gretchen said, we share screenshots, we share information about individuals that we're particularly concerned about. But then there's a question of how much information do we share and what is happening to that information afterwards. So often we try and clarify whoever we're sharing that data with. We trust them as a partner. We trust that they are going to also keep that information to themselves unless we agree on what action is going to be taken, and that if they are going to use that information, that they anonymize it as well if it's being public facing. So we try and maintain those relationships. And in terms of, we have been involved in advising on sort of undercover operations, these sting operation kind of things, but we've worked with professional bodies who are experienced. So for example, we have advised on a recently published BBC investigation into illegal trade in grey parrots to Bangladesh. And in that case, we were the ones advising. We were sort of providing our knowledge, providing some information that we knew, but it was the BBC team who actually carried out the undercover operation. And at every stage, they had to go to their editorial team for approval, and they had their own regulations in place. Having said all of this, like I said, we're quite new into this area and we're still very much learning. We've been sort of finding our way and we're still trying to do better. We're still trying to make sure that these systems are in place. And then we have a clear sort of set of things that we're following. And we're still trying to learn to do better. And it's a very tricky negotiation in terms of, you want to stop this illegal activity from happening. You're seeing, you know, hundreds of grey parrots taken from the wild that are ending up in these places, and we have the knowledge and experience to kind of know that, yes, this is illegal, this has happened illegally. So we feel like we need to take action and that we are uniquely positioned to be able to provide that assistance and take that action. And it's why I'm really grateful that this toolkit is here to help guide us in that, and to make sure we balance that with the potential harms that we can cause. I did just want to quickly pick up on what Gretchen said about this idea of what action do you take? And I think this is something that needs to be discussed, in that, yeah, if you have someone who you know about, and we're an example of this that she mentioned, we have someone who we know about, we know that they're involved in illegal activity, or we know that they're selling parrots that were taken from the wild. We don't necessarily have connections to law enforcement in that country that can take effective action, or we're trying to make that connection. Do we report it to the platform? We struggle with that as well, because then if they go down, then they may create a private account. We lose that information. And while we may still have the screenshots, they could go and create private groups, go onto WhatsApp and things like that. And we've lost that intel that we had before. We've lost the knowledge of exactly how this is happening. And so it's a really tricky decision as to what you do sometimes, and that has ethical implications in terms of the report. How long do you need to keep the data? So sometimes for us, it can be quite a long time if you don't quite know what to do with it. It's a really tricky area, but I hope that just from my ramblings, I've been able to provide some insight into how we've dealt with it. We're still learning, and I really welcome any questions, any thoughts, and any sort of conversation around it.
Thanks, Elisa. I'm certainly coming away from the panel discussion understanding that it's a minefield, and I'm hopeful that this community tool can provide some way to navigate that minefield. There's a lot of people in the audience, I think, who've got some direct experience also of working in these fields, and it'd be really great to hear from you. And as I said at the beginning, please do ask questions of us and challenge what we've done, and provide constructive comment would be very, very welcome. Either please could you raise your hand or pop a question in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that I pass it on to the relevant panelist. I have something here in the chat already, which I will just kick off with, if that's okay. We don't have a huge amount of time, so please get your questions in quickly. And the question is, hey, Elisa, are Grey Parrot Trust, the World Parrot Trust, monitoring the Indian domain sites? Because according to this participant's knowledge, there are many people in the African grey parrot trade in India, as it's considered an exotic species there.
Thanks a lot. India is an area that we're giving a lot of attention to. It's come to our attention relatively recently. We are liaising and talking to partners who are involved in law enforcement, who have a lot of experience with illegal wildlife trade in India, about following up some of it further. We haven't particularly investigated Indian domain sites. We've been particularly focused on social media and identifying people who are on social media. But that is something that I think we will want to look into. It's definitely an area that is on our radar and that we are dedicating quite a bit of time and attention to understanding, and particularly also we want to find the most effective way of stopping things. What's the easiest, what's the fastest, what's the best way of doing the most action? And for us, we're particularly trying to understand the trade routes and the means that parrots are illegally getting into India, for example, and we're dedicating a lot of attention to trying to cut those trade routes where appropriate. But yeah, we are very much aware of the issue.
Great. Thanks, Elisa. I would also draw attention to the a report that we published recently so GI-TOC and the World Parrot Trust did a study on African grey parrot trade in Africa, and we will find the link and pop it in the chat for you. And we've also been doing some joint work in Bangladesh, which is also featuring quite heavily on the radar of illicit trade. I don't see any, oh no, there is one. I was going to ask one myself. I was going to sneak in a cheeky one there for myself, but I'll save it. Daniel's asking, are there any experiences of doing this research on the Chinese market? Now, I know the answer to that, and I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to have a go. Gretchen, you're nodding. I'll hand over to you first, and then I will also add a little bit at the end, if I may, abuse my position as moderator.
Yes, I mean, we have in our own work, and we have many members independently who have focused on and continue to focus on the online wildlife trade in China, and also in Southeast Asian countries that sometimes host some of the markets that have been shut, the brick and mortar markets that have been shut down and say shifted into Laos or shifted into Malaysia. So we have a lot of folks working on that. I wanted to raise two issues that I think I didn't say as clearly as I would have liked to, and Elisa made reference to them as well, where one issue you have to think about as you're developing a project and considering whether to do active versus passive collection, or active versus passive engagement, or perhaps deception is the legality in the place that you're operating around entrapment. In some places, like the United States, it's relatively normal for law enforcement to engage in sting operations, and it's legal. So if you're cooperating with a law enforcement agency, that's fine. In other parts of the world, it is absolutely not legal to do that. And so it's really important to understand the legal framework in the place that you're operating. This can get very challenging in borderless cyberspace. Anyway, I'll let you go back to China. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, no, just to say that to Daniel, that GI-TOC have also been doing quite a considerable amount of work understanding the online trade in pangolin and pangolin derived products. So the traditional Chinese medicine or traditional Asian medicine markets online. We are about to release a report on that within the next month or so. That does detail quite some concerning findings actually across the globe, and I wouldn't, it's absolutely across the globe where we're finding evidence of this trade happening with impunity on online, easily accessible websites, e-commerce sites, etc. So please look out for that when it comes, because it's on its way, and as I said, some of the findings are quite disturbing. We've got another question here from Jonathan, talking around, and I'm not sure, Gretchen, maybe you could answer this from the ACO perspective. What's the copyright legality of using the screenshots of wildlife trade posts? And Elisa, maybe you'd like to have a go as well. Are sales advertisements in the public domain fair to use for educational or research purposes, or are they protected by those copyright laws because they're not your original photos? So I'm going to give that to Gretchen first and then hand over to Elisa if she has comments as well.
We believe, and our lawyers believe those to be to be not copyrighted content. It's another thing if you start downloading photos that have been taken by a news agency or a professional photographer. But if somebody, an amateur wildlife enthusiast or wildlife trafficker, puts a picture up of a pangolin or an elephant or a gray parrot, that's not a protected content. There are potentially more complexities about exposing content that goes inside a private group or chat room. In my opinion, no individual should have any expectation of privacy if they're putting content onto a social media platform. However, the laws do vary in some places, and there are, particularly with regard to Europe and the right to be forgotten, there are regulations around this stuff, and so you do have to watch out what you're doing with content. And we normally will send our documents, our reports for a legal review if we have the capacity to do so, the resources to do so.
Thanks, Gretchen. And also for flagging that, as you said earlier, it's a jurisdictional minefield, actually. And you're right to acknowledge that there are different regulations in place. And I would just point out at this juncture before handing over to Elisa that we released last year a community tool on trying to understand the legality of some of these advertisements. And there's a legality checklist, which you can sort of easily download from the website. And it gives you some kind of indicator, but it is very jurisdictionally specific. So it is quite complicated. Elisa, did you have a response?
Yeah, I'd agree that it's a very tricky area. And I think it just highlights something about this is that people are coming into this field, including myself, who you come in, do this research, and essentially often you're coming in with the precedent of what's been done before and what is done more widely, more broadly. So if other studies are including screenshots, if other studies are, and other individuals are including screenshots in presentations and all sorts, you tend to go with that precedent rather than really sort of getting into even knowing the details of the kind of data protection laws. And it's something that needs more consideration. I'm going to be honest, and I know that I'm not fully familiar with the implications of copyright, and it's something that I have contacts that I'm trying to find out from now. But there is a certain extent to where it's sort of, if it's public activity on social media, while there is an element of like, if you're putting something publicly, is it meant as, do you know it's meant to be public, or did you not really think it was going to be public? But I feel that there's a certain extent to which screenshots have a valid use in terms of demonstrating what's going on social media in the same way. And again, this is just me anecdotally, this is not based on the hard knowledge or experience, that a lot of news reports use screenshots of tweets and various posts. They anonymize the user, but the content in there is still widely shared to demonstrate what's going on. So that would be my perspective, but again, it's a gray area that needs more clarification, particularly with regard to this field, because I think you can have general rules, but then how it applies to the specific case is more tricky.
Yeah. Okay. One of the questions occurred to me as we were going through this, we've talked quite a bit about social media, and at the beginning, Gretchen, you also talked about algorithmic amplification. Presumably it works both ways then, right? I mean, if we're sharing some of this information and evidence with platforms, then they could potentially use algorithmic amplification in a reverse methodology, perhaps, to identify these things and take them down. What's your experience of that, Gretchen?
Absolutely. Our experience is that platforms aren't doing it, and we think they're not doing it. In particular, I'm referring to Facebook platforms, Facebook Blue and Instagram, and they're not doing it, we think, because these, we put out a study in 2020 called 2 Clicks Away, which is available on our website, counteringcrime.org. And in that study, what we found was that across multiple languages and across multiple species, that was actually specifically a report about wildlife as opposed to other serious crime. What we found was that the pages and groups that had the highest engagement did not get removed by Facebook. What they would remove is if they got a report and there was a page or a group that didn't have a lot of engagement. But some of the most heavily active groups had been going for years and had, in some cases, over 100,000 followers or members of the groups. So there's certainly things that platforms could do to put up speed bumps to stop algorithmic amplification on certain subject matter. We think they should do that. We think they should be legally required to do that. There's also things that they could do that don't require algorithms. Simple if code could block search results. If you go online and type "buy gray parrots," for example, or buy African grays, or buy cheetah cubs, or buy elephant ivory, or sell elephant ivory for sale, something like that. Endangered species plus sale terms. If you could simply block search results on that, you would be able to reduce a huge amount of the activity. Now, that's not going to be a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, but that is one. Criminals online need to be found. And what we found in that 2-click study was that about 60% of the groups and pages that we found had the endangered species term plus a combination of sale terms: buy, for sale, trade. That doesn't require, blocking that stuff doesn't require fancy algorithms. That's basic if code. And I put it to you that major platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok could block a huge amount of wildlife traffic in just a few shifts.
Thanks. Ali, Alistair, Alisa, any sort of responses from your side and your experiences? I mean, Alistair, we've had some experiences of sharing some of our data with African e-commerce platforms, and they've been very receptive. Alisa, have you had a similar experience from the World Parrot Trust perspective?
I think from our perspective, I essentially agree with everything Gretchen says, and I think that's the 2-clicks report. I'd recommend everyone go and read that, because that's informed a lot of our knowledge about the issue. I'm shocked sometimes by the posts that are available and the key term, because the thing is, there's a certain extent to which whenever you block terms, individuals will find new ways, and there have been groups that now specifically say in the group instructions, do not put posts with these terms in it, do not put for sale or available, and they will give a structure for how to set up the post so it's not picked up. So there's a sense to which, whether it's happening or not, there's an awareness by the people doing it that it's a risk, whether they felt it or not. But there are still so many posts out there, and I think particularly in non-English languages. So, for example, we've been monitoring grey parrots in North Africa particularly, and there are a lot of sort of Arabic terms for grey parrots, which are just there openly in the post, and it will say, you know, for sale or available, the equivalent terms. And if there was an algorithm which was picking up that kind of activity, you would have thought that those would have been taken down, but seemingly not. It's really difficult to know what's actually going on behind, you know, in the actual algorithms, in the moderation processes. But there is definitely a lot more that could and should be done.
Yeah, thank you. We're out of time, unfortunately, and I don't see any additional final questions in the Q&A. So I would absolutely thank everybody on the panel for taking the time to share your insights with us. And Alistair, thank you so much for all of the work that you put into this. I know that you worked really hard on it and for trying to make it digestible for everyone. And as I said, thank you so much for everybody for coming. Please go on, play around with the tool, answer those questions, use it as a sort of basis for planning your interventions and activities. And as Gretchen said, keep a strong eye on harm. And that includes to your staff as well, and to potentially innocent victims and vulnerable populations online. So thank you very much. I'm wishing you all the very, very best, and do send us any questions at mmfu@globalinitiative.net if you have any follow-up questions from the event. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.